Project Gorgon's community received challenging news back in November of 2023. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. I'm Marl MMO, and I connect gamers to MMOs they'll love. Enjoy this interview featuring Project Gorgon's lead developer, in which we discuss the status of the MMO, where it's going, and what challenges it still faces. It's an MMORPG in early access on Steam with nearly 2,000 very positive reviews. Moreover, I have free Steam keys to give away, so watch to learn how to win. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining me this cozy Sunday afternoon talking about Project Gorgon. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'll move aside, give you the soapbox pedestal, and allow you to introduce who you are, what's your story, and how has it led to Project Gorgon?
Oh, I really should have prepared something. Let's see. So I'm sorry. I tried to avoid preparing because it makes me anxious, and then I just get all.
Well, it's impromptu. This is jazz,
up,
right?
You know? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, go for it, man.
Yeah, I was a developer on Asheron's Call 2 back in the early 2000s, and what I really loved about Asheron's Call and Asheron's Call 2 was the live team was working on the live product and working with players to make the product better. So when that eventually petered out, we looked for other people to do that for. Sandra and I, as contractors, were pitched trying to find other MMO companies that wanted us to run a live team for them, and we did not. There are some lucky people who might get that job, but we did not get that job.
Okay.
But so eventually,
and by live team, are you referencing the somewhat, or maybe not beyond somewhat, the Asheron's Call 1, at least? I remember it had a monthly cadence of a continuing sort of meta story and content, or are you defining live team as something a bit separate than that?
No, that exactly, yeah. Once an MMO is made, an MMO takes like 5 years to make, and by the time it's done, your best and brightest developers are burned out on it, and so the live team is the people who work on the game after it is live. That is really the only definition to it. Is
okay, gotcha.
So, I mean, usually if there's going to be an expansion pack, that's a different team, but the people who are just keeping it running day to day and trying to make it work and adding content and fleshing it out.
Gotcha. Okay. No, thank you for the clarification. Go ahead.
And so eventually we just realized we'd have to make one ourselves, and that's kind of where Project Gorgon came from. It was in 2009, 2010, right around when Unity was becoming viable. I actually, in 2010, I was poking at Unity and trying to figure out how to make it turn into an MMO engine. And it wasn't until, let's see, I have to do the math backwards. I was 37. On my 37th birthday, I remember posting on Google Plus, I'm doing it. I'm going to make a
Google Plus. Yeah, man.
It was fun times.
Totally. Yes,
it was a great service. I wish it was. Yeah. Oh, anyway.
Yeah. Yep. I hear you.
And then a few years later, we had a prototype, and then a few failed Kickstarters after that. We had some backing, and then a few years after that, we got onto Steam, and a few years after that, we're here. And we're still not done with the damn game, but it's,
well, can you make the argument any MMO is finished? This is maybe a bit meta, but I see where you're going. I don't mean to play with words here, but I see what you're saying.
No, yeah, I mean, if I'd been a little, part of the problem is I really want to deliver on what I promised, and in those Kickstarters many years ago, I promised various features, and they're not done yet, so I'm not done. But I mean, from many other MMOs perspective, yeah, we would have launched a while ago, and probably when when the level cap was 50, not now when it's level 90. Yeah, we've essentially been adding expansion packs worth of content over the years to keep the game fresh while we develop all the other stuff like guilds and housing and all this other stuff we need to add.
Yeah, because you've effectively have had a live ongoing virtual service for, I don't know how many years you've been 24/7. So in a sense, you've had to maintain the amount of content for players who have been with you arm in arm for that entire period, yet at the same time, you still have that minimal viable product needing to be delivered. So it's this interesting balancing between those constraints that your team, as small as it is, has been able, I mean, like I was talking with your wife, that in context to an early access MMO, releasing level 90 content, that's incredible. If you take a step back and you think about the kind of echoing what you were saying earlier, you know?
Yeah, and yeah, you're right. Thinking about it that way, it's kind of absurd. I really should have gotten this out the door years ago. That would have solved a lot of problems.
But your team admittedly has accomplished a lot in context to its relatively small size. Now, admittedly, I haven't worked on your team. I haven't been in the back offices, so to speak. But I presume, if I can speculate, whatever the team size was for Asheron's Call 2 or EverQuest 2 with respect to your wife's history, I imagine that your resources may look a little different in context to Project Gorgon. Or am I speaking out of turn?
No, yeah, absolutely. So even the it's been decades, so I don't think the Asheron's Call people are going to be upset that I say that the Asheron's Call 2 had a team of 12. That was a live team. And they were able to put out a content, basically a dungeon a month. That was the cadence, and
that's incredible.
That
that's
is
absolutely amazing.
Right? Like,
yeah.
We're doing a dungeon every 3 months on average. Is essentially, I mean, just to think in terms of pacing, with essentially for many of the years it was literally just me, and then me and Sandra. And we have a few other people on the team now, but yeah, it's been interesting learning how to make a game with very few people and learning how to prioritize the sheer number of, I mean, as soon as it went 24/7, we had all kinds of new problems, as you can imagine, like hackers and support tickets and racists and all the usual stuff. So yeah. And that, but so the interesting thing is, I thought when I was doing the first Kickstarter, we had we had the server live at that point, and that was almost 9 years ago. And I'm like, I can prove it. It's I can do this MMO thing. I know you guys know how hard it is, and I'm showing you that I can do this. But regular players don't know how hard it is, and yeah, it was kind of a lost cause. I really should have focused on the graphics better, more than the uptime. But
though, from a back-end perspective, someone who works in tech, I completely harmonize and respect, and what word am I looking for here? Acknowledge the technical challenge of what you're describing, because it is so not trivial, and all the edge cases and all the responsibility and the disaster recovery and everything that goes into a 24/7 service, not to mention the user issues that you're discussing. Just getting it there is a monumental effort. And so, but I see what you're saying in terms of the marketing part of it, the wrapping it with the paper and the bow and making it a bit more presentable from that perspective. I do see where you're going with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame players for not knowing how hard it is.
Sure.
If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know how to make an MMO, then you're going to judge it on things you can judge, like graphics. That makes sense to me. But I was really hoping that what's really surprising is that a lot of other game developers, most other game developers who haven't tried to make an MMO, don't know how hard it is, and kind of disagree with you when you tell them how hard it is. Like, it's surprising, because they're like, on paper it should just be this set of features and then this amount of time, and you try to explain the multiplicative effect of this and this, and anyway,
isn't it? Yeah, it's like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? In a way, in which if someone, I guess maybe it's like the invert version of it, that someone who just doesn't know, but the person who does suddenly sees the massive heights of the mountain they have to climb, but someone who's, just been enjoying, Midwestern plains and thinks that's the extent of hiking, it's right.
Yeah. As a Florida hiker, that's a painful analogy. I hiked in Florida for many miles, and then hiked in Maine and just nearly died.
Oh, yeah. My wife's from Maine. We live in Colorado next to the mountains, so yeah, maybe that's where the analogy came from. But anyways, so curious, in context to where Project Gorgon is going, it's currently in beta, it's early access. You did mention wanting to, I guess I'm adding some words to what you were saying, but in terms of giving some attention to the graphical fidelity, I am loosely aware with, the polish phase of game development. Is that something, how do I want to say this? Is that a section in the timeline of Project Gorgon that you are still waiting to get to, or is it something that incrementally, as resources are provided or that you're able to allocate, that you iteratively improve?
That's a good question. Historically, it's been iterative in the sense that I have ADHD and I can't just sit down and do like a month's worth of polishing. So I will do a feature and also polishing at the same time. Or I eventually come back to revise a game system we wrote years ago, and at the same time I'll clean it all up and make it look as pretty as I can. But the last year or so, we've had Nick on our team, who is just basically the client guy now, and is able to spend time going through the many years of player suggestions. He's been implementing all the suggestions for how to make the UI better or how to make the combat flow better, and so we are in that kind of polishing phase and have been for a while now.
Oh, that's great to hear, because I have been following the updates to the UI. There's been a couple pacing adjustments to combat. So were a lot of those a function of his specific involvement?
I'm still basically responsible for the balance or lack thereof of everything, and everything else, like the at this point, Nick Nick had been taking orders from me. At this point, he's free to just fix whatever he thinks needs fixing in the game. So he does a lot of the UI fixes and combat flow fixes. All of the animation work has been Nick. Just a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Because maybe it was a year ago or so, I forget, but there was a major revamp to the HUD system that made it immediately easier to parse at almost a instinctual level, like intuitively what was going on, because before there were a lot of floating bars that indicated obviously all the different numbers behind the scenes of what is contributing to combat, but being able to make that less noisy, it was definitely just a discernible upgrade.
Thanks. I mean, that was all him, but thanks. We still
have shows the iterative element you're discussing.
Yeah, we just keep evolving it, and we still actually are supporting the old selection system because some players still prefer it, and we're trying to tease out why they prefer it and add those to the new selection system so that eventually we have one. But we just like to just keep iterating on that for month after month after month until it feels good.
Question. So connecting that observation to something you were describing earlier in terms of balancing all these competing priorities, in terms of still supporting the old targeting system, does that fall into what one would categorize as tech debt, or is that system still anchored in the newer UI logic, but you simply have two modes that a player can choose based on their preferences?
Yeah, I guess I would call it tech debt, although I mean, it's not tremendous, but I guess you're right that it's tech debt. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's and it's also the fact that, I mean, we've broken the old system a few times by adding while working on the new one, and then have to go back and maintain the old system. So you're in that way, it is definitely tech debt. So we have to eventually get rid of it. But
do you know why, from a psychological perspective, why certain players enjoy the older system, other than they simply had engaged with it for so long that it felt like the default experience?
There are really subtle click behaviors that are hard to exactly replicate. Like I click on this and then I clicked on this, and I expected to select this and I didn't select this. So it's just very, very nuanced.
Like muscle memory elements?
Yeah. And, the selection, like in the old selection system, you can click anywhere in a literal horizontal, a little rectangle around the person. And in the new system, you click on the person, which is a little harder for some people, right?
Okay.
So we're just keep fiddling with all of these variables and trying to figure out, maybe we expand that, maybe we make those selection boxes bigger, and just iterating it over and over.
Yeah, I relate. Before we started the recording, we were briefly discussing some professional past, and I used to work as a professional musician. I say this because depending on the type of music I was performing, I had to have a different snare drum, and the rim, the typically metal, I guess it could be wood depending on the drum, but there was a different height. You could measure this in millimeters from the head of the snare drum. And that millimeter, and it could even be a fraction of a difference, that drove me nuts so frequently, because all the nuance and the little details of how, your shoulder moves to your elbow bending to your fingers, all of that has been for thousands of hours of training drilled into me of what those little movements are. So the moment that changes by a fraction of a degree,
That's
suddenly, yeah. So I relate with
Huh.
people who have engaged for 500 hours, 1,000 hours, and they're used to a certain system, and suddenly you change a little teeny detail, and now they have to feel like they have to recalibrate, because in a way they do. So I definitely empathize with that struggle that can be present.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to go off on a tangent on the drum thing.
Go ahead. Yeah. What's up?
Is that because because you're resting the sticks on the lip of the snare drum and changing the angle?
That's a great question. So I am trying to discern how deep into this bunny hole I want to go, but basically, I played quite a bit of rock music, but also some Latin jazz, and so you had what were called rim shots, and these were specific type of notes you would play that were particularly amplified, because you could strike the rim and the center of the drum head and if you did it at the same time, it was kind of like if you ever jumped on like a trampoline with someone else, and you could do that double jump, where like the physics of someone jumps down first and then someone else jumps just a half a second later, and then like the compound physics would shoot that other person up really, really high. It reminds me of that, where if you're able to, I'm almost positive it's more or less at the same time identical. If you're able to hit the rim and the center of the snare at the same time, but obviously those angles are different, right? And so if you have just the tiniest of a difference of an angle with respect to, you mentioned that the lip, the rim of the snare drum, then when your brain is thinking, okay, I'm gonna deliver a rim shot at this particular time in the song, you actually will miss the rim and only just drill into the center of the snare drum. And in fact, by doing that, you deaden the head, and so you end up having basically a muted note, and so it ends up completely inverting and flopping. Now, obviously, the more you play, the more you kind of build in these different I don't know, and if we think about a parallel to exactly, so just like you have different UI modes, if someone's a healer or a tank or a bard or whatever else, you basically internalize all these different little minute changes if I'm playing on a wood rim snare, if I'm playing on a little piccolo, or whatever the case could be. So, but the first couple times we swapped out snares, it was definitely very jarring and embarrassing when you're supposed to have a very distinct sound and suddenly like the complete opposite comes out. But it's the result of just that 0.5 millimeter difference. So it's interesting to kind of think through that whole process.
Yeah, that's cool.
So in context to Project Gorgon's development and balancing all the dynamics with respect to the time it takes to build an MMO, there's the back-end support side, there's the development, the iteration, the art component. What has been, and maybe you can reduce this to a category, but I'll let you be the judge of it. What's been the most challenging dynamic of the journey of this process?
Well, I really have literally no art skill, and I guess I've been kind of stubbornly not collecting art skill over the years. So the art parts have been a lot of difficulty for me. It's really, part of it is that I just don't care much about the art, and so that.
Do you mean like the physics behind like how particle effects are rendered on the client side, or do you mean the color theory of how a sunrise should look, just from a help me understand?
Yeah, it's really that part, the part where I need to take, even if I'm using assets created by an artist, I need to level design them into a city or a dungeon, and it's taken many. Basically, I'm only now an adequate lighter of scene lighting. It's taken years to really learn how to not suck at it, and so many of the other parts I just haven't gotten to yet. Like I can't 3D model at all or texture things.
Well, your background is in programming, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay,
yeah.
so those are different skills. So I sympathize with the challenge of two very distinct modes of expression, right? But anyways, continue. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, yeah. So I mean, that kind of a lot of the game is distributing the tasks out into chunks that I can do, or Sandra can do, or we can have a contractor do. And you were just talking about the most difficult thing, and that is that my lack of skill there means that while I can very reliably chalk up tons of content to do or game systems to do, code work to do, it's really hard for me to gauge how long art is going to take, or to even communicate.
Gotcha.
Like, I need this and it needs to look like this. No, not like that. It's got to fit with all my other art, and I don't know how to explain to you what my other art looks like, but it needs to look like this. It's just hard.
Gotcha.
So that's been the, if I was going to do it over again, or if I wasn't quite so tired, I would learn some damn art skill. But
well, I don't fault you for not being perfect in every regard. Who would actually expect that? Now, I'm curious. I've been wanting to ask this question for a while. The demo island is one of my favorite areas in Project Gorgon, and I don't know if that's due to the ground textures or the topography, or
a lot of that is that is actually like we bought that. We bought like half that island is a demo scene, and we just ran with it. So
yeah, it felt fantastic. And so obviously from your perspective, wanting to have everything harmonious with itself, but that definitely felt really, really nice. And then also a lot of the dungeon scenes, I also feel
we've been working
conjugate, but anyways, go ahead.
Over the years, we've actually just slowly been trying, and I mean, the things that we've managed to retexture the most are dungeons. We'll just be going, no, this dungeon doesn't meet our style guidelines anymore. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Dungeons should be easy, but yeah, even those are hard to make look good.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in fact, the amount of dungeons in Project Gorgon is an anchor point for me, perhaps due to me cutting my teeth on early MMOs like, EverQuest, UO, Asheron's Call, where dungeons were some of the areas in which some of the best loot dropped, and there's a lot of socialization and cooperation and challenge. And so whenever I see open world dungeon design, that's automatically a massive check box that's already been met for me. So being able to see this massive list, on the wiki of all the dungeons I've yet to explore is definitely a fun forecast for me.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, awesome. So we have been currently talking about points that I presume most people who are already familiar with Project Gorgon would be able to track with us. For someone who is not as familiar with Project Gorgon, perhaps they've heard about the Kickstarter years back, maybe the recent news has caught their attention. For someone who hasn't played, or they haven't played in a while, to you, what is Project Gorgon? What's the target audience? What's unique about it from your perspective?
It is a game designed around my ADHD. That's really
a manifestation of your cognition.
Yeah. So when I was sitting down to design the game, I one of the design goals was that I like working on a live game, and so it has to be that I can every month for the rest of time, if I want to, I can sit down and add a new skill to Project Gorgon forever.
Yeah, gotcha. Yep.
So design. I mean, you can't just do that to any game. You couldn't just keep adding skills to UO. There's a skill point cap, right? Like you have to design the game around that idea. Because of that, the game has a really interesting effects that weren't exactly my intent, but have come to be really important to me. Basically you can do everything on one character if you're willing, but so doing so will mean learning skill 200 or 300 skills. Actually, I think it's like 150 skills at this point, but you have to just dive down. Each one of those is a rabbit hole of its own, right? Each skill, almost every skill feels different in the sense that it has different mechanics to learn. So it's really mechanics dense, and the interactions between the different mechanics is really important to learn and part of the game. One of the goals of all of these systems is to make the player feel clever for figuring out how all these systems come together. By the end of the game, you're a really brokenly powerful character because you figured out all of how to put all this stuff together, and that's fun. That's, I think, one of the secret sauce of those old school MMOs is just the mechanics working with each other to create something that isn't just cookie cutter.
I deeply admire that principal anchor to Project Gorgon's design. I'm curious, did you ever play Anarchy online?
I did not very much. I remember the launch when you couldn't see
It did
people.
have it did have an infamous launch. Did you ever get into the implant system?
I don't remember it. If I did.
Okay, I'm gonna tie this together here because this just popped into my brain. I'll tie it back to Project Gorgon. But in essence,
Cool.
your character could attach implants that boosted certain attributes. And the way the system worked is you could ad infinitum, well, not literally at infinitum, but pretty close to it. You could use one implant to then just get you above the edge to equip the next stage of implants, and so on and so forth. Presuming that you could actually afford the level 50 upgrade, but you could do this as a level like 7 character. So what ended up happening was you would have characters that would be sufficiently strong as like a level 50 or a 75 tune from an attributes perspective, but they're only level 5 or 7 or 10 or something. And Anarchy Online had a very, I don't know if dynamic is the right word, but they had maybe an active PvP scene, but it was level restricted. So you can see where this is going. So you had this very dynamic twink culture where people would drill into the mechanics of how does this system interact with this, and how do I leverage the benefits of this other system over here. And so again, coming back to Project Gorgon, there's this old school rewarding the player's creativity and finding the fun in that recipe versus, to your point, the moment I have a sense that an MMO or a game in general doesn't value whatever creative expression of my intelligence that I have, the moment that I see that I'm just on a track and that is it, I just lose interest. That's not interesting to me. But the moment that I sense that a game does in fact put the fun as a result of like a function of my own ingenuity, and obviously there's a back and forth with that, and there's balance, and you don't want it to be so outrageously overpowered that someone becomes a de facto god and ruins the experience for everyone. But with that said, if you get a sense that the game is cheering you on for you thinking that you discovered something, or that you found this clever interaction with this skill and that skill in this particular encounter, then those are really the moments that stick out to me, and I think for actually a lot of people. And I definitely get that sense notably and deeply in Project Gorgon.
Yeah, those moments when unexpected game mechanics combine and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm clever. Yeah, exactly. I love
right. And it reminds me of almost a typical loop in Project Gorgon. So for example, the gourmand skill, in which you become better at eating foods. And what's funny is I look at like my own life, and come to think of it, like it is actually a skill in reality. Yeah. Like you learn the different textures, you learn which different types of peppers work well. And anyways, I say that because in order to get the ingredients that you need to have like a butchery skill, right? But then you need to level that up sufficiently. But if you're going to make a certain recipe, you have to know where the certain boar lives, and right, and then you have to have a certain combat skill to defeat the boars, and all of these interact with each other with the end goal of having this beef stew. But by going through the whole process of actually getting the stew, there's two components, at least in my mind. The first is you actually leveled up a lot of different skills instead of just only one specific thing, and so you feel like your character is progressing not just in one particular area. But number two, it has almost like an old school RuneScape vibe, in that like it's not that it's more about the journey, but it's not like you get a quest and you have to go kill 5 of these and you just repeat it, and that's basically the whole journey. Whereas in Project Gorgon, it feels more player centered, more player agency, and even though you end up creating, or maybe cooking rather, that specific stew, it's about all the little moments that led up to that, and I think Project Gorgon does a good job of curating those natural experiences.
Thank you. Yeah, we work hard on those. I mean, unfortunately, the flip side is if we're not telling you exactly what to do and you get lost, you're just totally lost, right? But
sure.
And so we're constantly trying to figure out where the sweet spot is between a pop-up, anything from a gross pop-up warning to an NPC saying something to help cue you in on something it's hard to figure out where those sharp edges are. But I really like letting people figure out the systems and how they come together. That's a big part of the game.
Yeah, circling back to the intro island, I felt like that had a beautiful balance between self-discovery and NPCs prodding your character to figure out the different ways in which they could complete a given puzzle. Obviously, after the intro island, it opens up quite a bit. And so, I do remember, like, in particular, I guess, spoiler alert here, there's the guy in the hut, and I think he's one of the ways you can learn psychology, and you could use that to damage one of the, and again, I'm kind of having to dig through, like, archaeologically the memories in my head, but there's a like a training
dummy
thing. Yes, and it can't be damaged by kinetic damage or something, but psychology, or there's another type of combat skill I think you can learn on the island that enables you to damage it to complete that little puzzle.
There's one more.
Yeah, I forget exactly which one it was, but all that to say is there wasn't just one way to complete it. And in the context of the demo, you could solve that puzzle a couple different ways. But the game also, it gave this space for you to discover what that looked like for your own experience. But there's also that little prodding from the guy in the hut, and I forget exactly what the details were to learn it. But that felt like a nice balance to me, just kind of thinking back on that.
Thanks. Yeah, we worked. So it's really tricky. Like we worked really a long time on trying to get the content on the island to be paced just right.
Yep.
But the problem is that we can't spend that much time on every half hour's worth of gameplay experience, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so it becomes a much broad. Suddenly you get off the island and the content is shotgunned at you, and just you just suddenly are drinking from the fire hose in terms of the things you can do and places you can go, and it's been weird to realize that the feedback we get on the Newbie Island is either, "Hey, I love this, make the game more like that," which I'm trying. But the alternative is B, I hate this. Just I want to play the game. Get out. Let me skip the demo. I'm like,
interesting. So now behind that, so that's that second criticism, and obviously you're amalgamating kind of a spectrum of different feedbacks.
Yeah.
When you hear that type of feedback, from your perspective as the main developer, and I don't want to accidentally corner you here, I'm just legitimately curious. Do you feel like that feedback indicates that for that given player, that Project Gorgon just isn't the type of experience that selects for their interests? Or do you think they're actually trying to say something else, like, hey, I like the idea here, but just the puzzle pieces aren't quite fitting right? Like, how do you gauge and filter and interpret feedback from a player that may be more used to a what am I trying to say? I guess that actually does work. Theme park is actually what I'm trying to say, but maybe railroad, my intuition there was maybe more on cue, where this is the experience, there's not a lot of flexibility, you're just on this track, versus the more open-ended type of experience and preference. So how do you gauge that?
Yeah, it's a mostly guesswork.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think what's interesting though is that most of the people coming to Project Gorgon hear that it is an open world game without hand holding, and that is why they're there.
Yes.
And so the spectrum isn't really people who want a World of Warcraft quest hub every few feet.
Right. Yep.
It's people who want to have an island full of content, and the other end of that spectrum is people who want RuneScape but with better combat. And somehow,
sure. Yes,
that we were able to deliver on that, and their friends told them that it's RuneScape with better combat, and now they have to deal with these puzzles on this island, and they don't care. And so it's taken a while to try to kind of piece together what's going on, and it keeps changing as we improve something, and suddenly we get very different feedback, and like, why am I hearing this now? Yeah, you're right. It's totally it's a puzzle, a bit of a puzzle, but that's where we are right now. Is just I guess we just iterate on this Newbie experience for the rest of time.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Newbie Experience can function as its own filter, and not that it's wrong if someone has a different set of preferences, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, you don't want to either misrepresent or bring someone who would actually, in fact, love Project Gorgon, but perhaps they've been conditioned or they have a different set of expectations that only if they could get over some hump, whatever that is, that they would suddenly realize that their interests are in harmony with Project Gorgon. So yeah, that does sound difficult. So yeah, I sympathize with that.
Yeah, I mean it's a big game, and there's room enough for a lot of different play styles and people who want to do different things. But obviously, the Newbie Experience can't be for everybody. So yeah, that is.
Yeah, yep. Now, in context, we were discussing its similarities with RuneScape. We briefly talked about Anarchy Online. You mentioned your professional past and Asheron's Call 2. I believe Sandra, your wife, Esrand, on the team, she's worked on EverQuest 2 as well. What are the major influences, maybe not just copycatting, right, but the types of gameplay elements or even feelings, like the emotive experience of your professional history, but also just the games you enjoy to play? What are the different influences that you wanted to bring into Project Gorgon that find manifestation there?
Well, I had a blog back in the day where I was brainstorming all kinds of different game MMO ideas that seemed fun, from being able to type the words of power in chat idea to being just weird ideas that I really wanted to try. I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
I probably cast a net too wide. I could shorten it here by what various influences, whether it's personal or professional, that have found their way into Project Gorgon, whether it's a reference in passing or it's a, like, for example, I don't mean to steal any thunder here, but Sandra and I were talking about Star Wars Galaxies and the Cantina and the social features and the various musical systems in Project Gorgon, and how there seems to be a fun, nostalgic parallel there, things like that.
Interestingly, one of my not original but later focuses has been Diablo 3 and Diablo 4, in very specific ways. Like we played just a tremendous amount of Diablo 3, and
same.
It was impossible to tell whether a new piece of equipment was going to be better or worse. I mean, the tooltip system in Diablo 3 was so bad that I'm like, and my tooltip system was not better at the time, and I'm like, I'm going to do better. And re-architected how tooltips work in order to more accurately show information. So that's been a big focus, is just how can I beat Diablo at its own game in terms of combat mechanics.
That's interesting you bring that up, because in my coverage of Project Gorgon, it must have been when I was doing my series on it, I specifically highlighted the link between Diablo-style uniques, or maybe they were legendaries, excuse my language, in which a piece of gear would drop and it would directly modify one of your skills. And I remember, I forget when you included that feature in Project Gorgon, but it wasn't limited to just the very best skill, or sorry, the very best type of item like in Diablo. Instead,
Right.
it was more broadly like the ARPG. Well, no, it's even broader than ARPGs, because come to think of it, whether it's Path of Exile, Grim Dawn, Torchlight, a lot of the modifiers on equipment tended to just add raw damage or modify an attribute, but very rarely would they actually modify a skill. Grim Dawn got into that, Diablo obviously with its legendary system, but what blew my mind, and what I've said repeatedly, what I absolutely love about Project Gorgon's gearing system is, I forget at what tier of gear it starts happening, maybe it's at the very default level, I forget, or maybe it's just the tier above, but the modifications directly affect your equipped skills. And that harmonizes so well with what I think is interesting about gearing systems, because, okay, sure, +5 strength, okay, like I'm marginally better, awesome, whatever. But if I get something that ties into, every time you use, I'm just gonna make up an ability here, sword /1, but that also heals me for 5 points of damage, or it also, actually, I'm representing this incorrectly. Like in Project Gorgon, you have armor, And so let's say I forget what the first default sword skill ability is, but by default, I don't think it has any like armor regeneration. But if a piece of gear
sword slash,
yeah, and so by having equipment that directly modifies what this does and thus also changes its tactical utility, that suddenly gives the player all these sort of thought experiments in terms of, oh, if this suddenly either restores my armor or maybe it takes away armor from the opponent, maybe there's a certain set of gear that you keep on stacking these, armor nullification augments, so that when you go to fight in a place that the foes are heavily armored, it suddenly is like you're cutting through warm butter, right? Instead of frozen, I don't know, whatever the alternative would be. So I've absolutely adored the gearing system in Project Gorgon. I didn't mean to steal any thunder there. I just wanted to be enthusiastic as a player and an enjoyer of the game, and how it is, to me, one of my favorite components about the MMO.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's kind of gotten away. I mean, obviously, MMOs aren't really known for their. I guess that's not true anymore. I mean, but in any case, yeah, it has become a big part of the game, is the gear system and the leveling. And you're right. Basically, at the start of the game, you're going to find gear that makes abilities do different stuff. Like one of the abilities has one of the sword abilities has a special mod that turns it into an area of effect ability, and suddenly, instead of hitting one person, you're hitting everyone around you. And then, I mean, that has its own problems, right? That like you'll find that sword with that mod on it, and you'll find a new sword with much more damage on it, and you'll not want to get rid of that first power up, and you'll have to learn about extracting abilities and then augmenting abilities. And there's a whole line of skills there to master also.
What other influences have come into Project Gorgon from your experience?
Lord of the Rings Online was it's been a while just thinking about how Lord of the Rings Online worked and how I could pull some of the ambient magic in.
That's a great way to say it. It does have a special ambient feeling that's distinct.
Yeah, and I mean, that starts from the UI and goes right into the text. I mean, it's an ambiance. Yeah, the one that I probably played the most was EverQuest 2, and really loved the group combat early EverQuest 2, and that was really a focal point. And I realized too that EverQuest 2 did not have a sustainable population of people who wanted to group, and so I mean, I haven't tried to replicate EverQuest 2's grouping mechanics, but some of the feel of EverQuest 2's dungeons. Like you could go into a dungeon in EverQuest 2, and if it was a busy dungeon, there'd be people, and you LFG, and you could jump into that group, hopefully. That I really like that part. I like the being in a dungeon, and so that part is also a steal from another game.
So the fluid socialization and how there's consensual cooperation, although the game, with respect to dungeons, it would select generally for a group-based approach, yet there's still this middle wiggle room in which there's still capacity to solo, but the game would still naturally nudge you to link arms with other adventurers.
Yeah, did you play EverQuest 2 a bunch? Do you?
Yes, so I played EverQuest 1 a bunch, played EverQuest 2 quite a bit, especially more on their legendary servers. I did play during a number of their expansions. So the Fate Arc expansion I played, I didn't play on release, unfortunately, but then I also played when they released their Kunark expansion.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So there were definitely, and then it was... Man, this was when I was still living in California. I was playing with a buddy on one of their legendary servers, and I think the level cap was 60 at the time, and I think we got to level 50. He was a paladin, I think, and I was the bard, but it wasn't. It was the more offensive bard. I forget the name. They had all these different subclasses.
The dirge, yeah.
The dirge, yeah. So that was a fun take, like a roguey bard, right?
Yeah.
So I in fact, I've been trying to. How do I say this? After talking with your wife, I've wanted to spin up EverQuest 2, in fact, and play it again. But I know that I have other more pressing things to do.
Yeah, it's too dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But I originally cut my teeth on EverQuest 1 way back 1999, and so it's really fascinating to see the evolution, even just within that franchise, of how grouping was conceptualized and made manifest in the virtual world. And I'm curious, when you were playing, when you were in a group-based zone, I seem to remember in EverQuest 2, because EverQuest 1 had a different system, but in EverQuest 2, you had mobs that were tagged together, and after clicking on one of them, you could see how many were in that group. That polling. I don't know if it was a radius or if it was just. Yeah, go ahead.
I still want to steal that. As a new player to EverQuest 2, that was an incredibly overwhelming thing to click on one monster and see like 5 others split up.
Yes.
But it's so informative and cool. I would love to do that at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, because in EverQuest 1, you only knew which mobs were tagged only experientially, usually by death. And so in EverQuest 2, they made it a bit more explicit in that you could better forecast which group of mobs were coming. And I don't remember if there were classes that could decouple a certain group of mobs. Like I know in EverQuest 1, the druid had a spell, I believe it was called Harmonize. I'm gonna have to double check myself. People who are listening already know if I'm right or wrong on this, but basically you could is mole the right word? You could basically reduce the threat, both the range and the like aggressiveness of mobs in a circle, and that way, instead of pulling a group of orcs, you could cast this spell, and then whenever you would attack one, only one would come. And it ended up being like you got the spell at like level 8, but depending on where you were, you could be level 50 and still be using that level 8 spell because the utility was so incredible. I say that because I don't know if in EverQuest 2, if there were abilities that could, let's say you click on a mob and there were 3 there. I don't know if there were any skills that could turn that 3 into a 2 or something.
Yeah, I can't think of a skill that would do that in EverQuest 2, although you could mesmerize and take over one of them and turn them into an ally for a time. There's so many other verbs.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah, like the enchanter or something. Yeah, interesting. So, okay, well, that's fascinating. Now, because your wife worked as sort of a production sort of executive on the back end, were you mostly just a player of EverQuest 2, or did your professional experience overlap with any of that?
No, yeah, I was, when Sandra was working on EverQuest 2, I was officially an indie game developer. I was working on Flash games and mobile games, that sort of thing. So,
sure. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so that I was just a player, and I had an ear to the team because
sure.
But I'd played it for many years before Sandra got to working on it, and played for a while after she left. So yeah.
Gotcha. No, that's so interesting. So with respect to Project Gorgon, which feature, because we've been talking about influences and our histories and different just internal selection factors in terms of what we enjoy about various games. When you take a look at Project Gorgon, what's either the feature of which you are most proud, or what is maybe a pillar of gameplay that you are most proud of? And you can also forecast a little bit here if you want to aim into the future in terms of where a certain feature is going, or if there's something on the horizon that's fun to talk about. What's definitely, when you think back, your heart warms a bit thinking about it with respect to Project Gorgon?
I should have thought of something for this. I mean, it's an obvious question, and I get so down on myself that it's really hard to look back and be like, "Oh, that was a great thing." It's more of a, that was adequate. Like the.
Sorry, I so relate to the inner critic. No, I totally understand that. You could do something and everyone's cheering you on. You're like, "Dang it, I could have done that better."
Yeah. Like
maybe I could rephrase it. Which feature or angle of Project Gorgon that, just if in terms of your intuition, that the community has highlighted repeatedly that they're really fond of?
Oh, well, the community likes the community. And the community is
yes.
Yeah, the game is really designed around the community in a lot of important ways. I was going to say something else. The subtlety of the storytelling is something that I am proud of. Just on a side note there, that quests, curses like the Ranelon curse that makes you spout Ranelon propaganda in your chat messages, right? That tells the backstory of the game.
Yes.
in ways that nobody else is going to read, right? I mean, you don't have to read. So I'm proud of that part of that, the subtlety there.
I love implicit storytelling. So like even like the mantis with the hat and how that's a signal to a larger ontological conversation. I definitely appreciate that. Yeah.
And I guess the community features really do need to be pointed out, and I should be proud of them because they took a lot of work. There's a lot of skills that allow you to help other players, and do so freely and with sometimes with no cost and sometimes with modest cost to yourself. And there's a lot of them. There's tons of ways to help other players.
What are some examples to someone who may not have experienced them?
If you play music with other players in town, you will start a musical performance, and anyone listening to the performance will get a buff, a random various buffs to their XP gain and that sort of thing. Or you can be an artist crafting statues and then place the statues in town, and anyone who examines the statues gets a buff. Or you can be growing vegetables, and other players can come and play music for you to help your vegetables grow faster. I mean, just tons of different ways. In the cold areas, there's campfires that players can keep lit in order to let newbies get through the freezing climbs without dying. There's no real reward for doing it, but they tend to keep them lit pretty well. Just being able to be giving opportunities to help other players, not forcing you to, but letting you, has been a big important part. Yeah. I guess I should talk about where the project is, which is out of money, basically. Sandra has cancer, and it's been harder to work in the last while, and so we've run out of our back padding. So we've asked our community. Our community has donated some $30,000 to us, which gives us several more months to figure out what we're doing and where we're going. And in the short term, I think we're looking at, what can we do to get more eyes on the project and get more people involved? Because we think in terms of VIP subscriptions, because it's a predictable amount of money. So if we could practically give the game away if we got enough VIP subscriptions from it. So we're looking at different ways to. Obviously, if people are hoping to play the game soon, they wait until the Steam Christmas sale, because we'll be on sale for the Christmas sale. But after that, I'm thinking we're going to need to create a version of the game that is in the $15, $10 price point, one character slot on that, and then you can buy more character slots with an expansion, that sort of thing. Basically helping to get more people in, and then also features that help get new players up to speed and kind of grind down some of the sharp points that are keeping new players from sticking around. We've been doing that for years. There's so many sharp points, but yeah, that's our short-term goal. If we get enough, at the same time we're working on Statehelm. Well, we're working on the design documents of Statehelm, which is the massive final city of the game. If we manage to have enough money to keep going in terms of developing after the next few months, then Statehelm is probably the next big thing to come out of our development. Statehelm is the home of the instanced housing. So
so a lot of tangentially related features are also wrapped up in Statehelm.
Right, and so Statehelm has become this giant looming thing where we won't be able to launch Statehelm as this masterpiece, but we'll start rolling out the various aspects of Statehelm, the NPCs, and then the dungeons, and then the new skill systems, etc. So I'm excited about that. I hope we are able to do that.
Again, Eric, appreciate you. Sandra, I know that my MMO history has been benefited as a result of your design. I remember distinctly playing Asheron's Call 2, and then I played, like we were talking about, EverQuest 2. Obviously, that'd be more of a Sandra's thing, but and again, I've enjoyed Project Gorgon deeply, and only have the best hopes for its future, and hoping that despite the challenging news, that there is still that rising phoenix out of it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Anything else you'd like to add?
Nothing comes to mind. But this has been fun. Worries. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been absolutely a delight. Awesome. Thank you to Project Gorgon's development team for being willing to engage in my series of interviews. In order to enter the raffle for a free Project Gorgon Steam key, please download the free demo. Comment below regarding what you both enjoyed and disliked. I'll be in contact with the winners. Thank you for watching, and subscribe for more MMO content.